All right, looks like we are ready to go. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Destiny Tolbert. I serve as the Assistant Director of Student Success and Outreach in the Multicultural Center. I also co-facilitate #BLM Planning Committee here at UT Dallas. It is my joy and pleasure to welcome each of you to our program this afternoon. Reproductive rights are human rights. And as part of our Women's History Month program, this conversation will focus on social reproductive justice issues today and on the horizon. We will have the opportunity to hear from our special guest, Professor Ross, followed by a panel discussion about the history of reproductive justice struggles in the US, the challenges of parenting students, and reproductive healthcare resources available on campus at UT Dallas. So before we begin this program, we want to take time to start by acknowledging the history and legacy of colonization. UT Dallas stands on land originally settled and occupied by the Caddo, Wichita, and Comanche people. We recognize the history of UT Dallas begins with the forced removal of the indigenous people through the legacy of colonization. So just some trigger points here. Sorry, I'm going ahead of myself in my agenda, but just so you know what our agenda kind of looks like for today, we have our introduction that I'll be giving, introducing our moderator, and then that is our land acknowledgement agreement as well. So just a forewarning for you all, this is a teach-in and segment may include readings, it may include media, discussion around topics such as sexual assault, violence, child abuse, racism, and identity-based discrimination and harassment. We do want to acknowledge that this content may be difficult and also encourage you to care for your safety and well-being as well. I do want to also mention that just some housekeeping rules, that if you would turn off your cameras and mute yourselves while our speaker is presenting and giving her talk, we would really appreciate it as well. We want to be respectful of the message going forward. So thank you in advance. And I think at this time, we are going to go ahead and just introduce our moderator. So I have the pleasure of introducing Desiree Johnson. She earned her Bachelor of Applied Arts in Science and Public Affairs and Community Service, as well as her Master's of Educational Technology and Organizational Leadership from the University of North Texas. She is currently working as the assistant to the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities. She recently served as the Menstrual Equity Teach-In and is passionate about influencing equity of all minority groups. Please help me welcome Desiree Johnson.
Hello, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Loretta Ross. She's an award-winning expert on racism, racial justice, women and human rights. Her work emphasizes social justice issues and how intersectionally we can fuel transformation. She is a nationally recognized trainer on using the transformative power of reproductive justice to build a human rights movement that includes everyone. A few of her leadership positions include co-founder and national coordinator of the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. She's also the national co-director of the 2004 March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C., the largest protest march in the US history. She is the founder and executive director of the National Center for Human Rights Education. Dr. Ross is a graduate of Agnes Scott College and holds honorary doctorates from Loretta University and Smith College. She's a visiting associate professor at Smith College in the program for the study of women and gender, teaching courses on white supremacy, race and culture in America, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture, all while pursuing her PhD in women's studies from Emory University in Atlanta. She has co-written 4 books on reproductive justice, one being Reproductive Justice, an Introduction. It is the first of its kind that provides a comprehensive yet concise description of the field and puts the lives and lived experiences of women of color at the center of her book. She's a model of how to survive and thrive despite the traumas and disproportionate effects of low-income women of color. She's a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Loretta Ross.
Well, thank you for that excellent introduction. It is always an honor and a privilege to speak to a college in my home state because I was born down the road from y'all in Temple, Texas. And of course, you could take a girl out of Texas, but you can't take the Texas out of the girl. I am fortunate to be able to write about my lived experiences. When I was growing up in Texas, in San Antonio to be particular, I became pregnant when I was in the 10th grade of high school in San Antonio by a married cousin who thought it was a good idea to get me drunk so that he could have sex with me. He was 27, I was 14. And unfortunately, back in 1968, I didn't have a lot of options. My only option was, of course, to continue the pregnancy and to choose whether or not to give the child up for adoption. I chose to keep my son, and that changed my entire life, but it not only changed my entire life, co-parenting with the man who raped me, but it also changed the San Antonio Independent School System because once I had the baby, the school didn't want to readmit me to finish up graduating. They said that because I had proof that I'd had a child, and that I could, let me see, how did she put it? She said, well, Loretta, if we let you back in, other girls might get pregnant. Which is the silliest reasoning I'd ever heard in my life, because whatever I didn't know about biology, I knew I could not impregnate other girls. So my parents had to threaten to sue the San Antonio school system for my right to be readmitted to school. They caved. I went back to school in the 11th grade and finally graduated in 1970 and left Texas almost forever, going to Howard University. And I haven't lived back there since then, but I'm always overjoyed to have a chance to come back to Texas to visit relatives. And my son and grandson both were in Texas, and so spent a lot of time there. But I tell you that brief biography to tell you why I became interested in feminist issues as a whole, but particularly violence against women, since I did not have a choice on if and when I would have sex, and reproductive rights, because I also didn't have a choice on whether or not to continue an unwanted and unplanned pregnancy or not. And so living at those intersections, I think prepared me for dealing with and helping to co-create the concept of reproductive justice in 1994. I was fortunate enough to have been one of 12 Black women who were at a conference in Chicago in June of 1994, organized by the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance. And at this conference, we heard a presentation by a member of the Clinton administration that was trying to achieve healthcare reform. And this presentation basically said that the Clinton administration had decided to either de-emphasize or remove reproductive health care from the healthcare reform proposal as a way of increasing the likelihood of lessening Republican opposition to healthcare reform. Now, whatever you thought about that strategy, and I have to honestly say I didn't think much of it, what that eventually did was call upon a feminist conference to endorse a healthcare plan that was fundamentally very male-centric. Because if you remove reproductive health care from healthcare reform, you remove the major driver of women to the doctor. Let me explain. This is what we thought about, the 12 of us, as we were problematizing this presentation. We believe that both the pro-choice and the pro-life movement started at the wrong place. They started with the pregnancy, when in fact, it is much more realistic to start upstream before the pregnancy to examine what's going on in the person's life long before they become pregnant. And so the 12 of us Black women started thinking about how, when people are facing an unplanned pregnancy, they're dealing with worrying about whether or not they can keep a job, whether they can stay in school, whether or not they'll experience violence if they tell their partners, will they get kicked out of the home if they tell their parents who don't want to hear that, whether or not they can guarantee and protect their own future if they become pregnant outside of their own timetable. And when the pro-choice and the pro-life movements only focus on the pregnancy, they're failing to look at those upstream issues that are really human rights issues that have to be considered, because those human rights concerns will determine whether or not the unplanned pregnancy is turned into a wanted child or an abortion. Because if the person has bad answers to those human rights concerns and issues, then they're probably going to turn an unplanned pregnancy into an abortion if they have the means, the access, and the availability. But if they have good answers to those questions, then that unplanned pregnancy is most likely to be transformed into a wanted baby. And so what we did in that conversation was splice together the concept of reproductive rights and social justice to coin the term reproductive justice, which is situating the struggle for abortion rights in a social justice framework that made more sense to us because it addressed how abortion was so frequently and inaccurately isolated from all the other social justice issues. Then 3 months later, I was one of thousands of people who attended the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, Egypt. And what I discovered in September of 1994 was that women from the Global South, as part of the global women's health movement, were using the human rights framework to demand the same kind of protections we were talking about and desiring under the reproductive justice analysis. And we felt that this was a much more sturdier foundation, legal regime, replete with norm standards and treaties and conventions and things on which to rest our demands for reproductive justice. It was far superior to use the human rights framework than to rely on the paper-thin protections afforded by the US Constitution. Because as we have learned much to our regret, the right to privacy is only inferred in the US Constitution. It is not guaranteed, not like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Bill of Rights. It is only inferred. And what the Supreme Court giveth, the Supreme Court can take it away. It's just why we're worried about the threat ongoing threat to Roe after more than 50 years. We should not be dealing with this, but yet here we are. So we felt that bringing human rights home was our best strategy coming from the Cairo conference. And as I explain the fullness of the human rights framework, you'll understand why I think this is so important. But before I get to that, let me further define what we mean by reproductive justice. We joined with the pro-choice movement fighting for the right not to have a child. So that includes fighting for the right to use birth control, to use abortion, or abstinence if it works for you. Some people claim it does. I've never abstained from anything, so I don't know. But it's a great theory. But because this theory, excuse me, was created by Black women, because reproductive justice was created by Black women, we also stand at the intersection of white supremacy, racial oppression, and gender oppression. And that results for us in needing to fight all strategies of population control, also known as eugenics. And so the second tenet of reproductive justice is to fight for the right to have the children that we want to have. And because our fertility is blamed for everything, whether it's the mortgage crisis of 2008, whether it's the growing crime problem or bad schools or whatever it is, people want to blame Black women's wombs for everything, it seems like, under a white supremacist construct. And so fighting for the right to have children also includes fighting for the conditions under which we give birth, which of course brings into the conversation the use of midwives and doulas, and having your birth plans respected when you go to hospitals, and resisting, for example, an unnecessary cesarean section if it's not medically necessary and is done for other reasons like profitability or doctor's convenience or whatever. And so that's the second tenet of reproductive justice. And the third one that we formulated in 1994 is probably the most expansive because it concerns the human right to raise and parent your children in safe and healthy environments. And when you demand that of reproductive politics, you're basically bringing into conversation every field of human endeavor. You're talking about gun violence as a threat to children, or environmental problems as a threat to children, or unfair property tax schemes that underfund some schools, or climate change. I mean, there's so much that we do that really challenges our right and our ability to raise children in safe and healthy environments. That reproductive justice goes far beyond both biological issues like birth control, abortion, and birthing plans into non-biological issues like how credit scores can be abused to punish poor people, or how housing insecurity can lead to preterm births and unnecessary uh, uh, sterility and things like that. So we talk about a lot when we use the third tenet of reproductive justice. So since we had this right to have a child, right not to have a child, and the right to parent our children in safe and healthy environments as our core, we were attracted to the human rights framework because the human rights framework offered a better and, as I said, sturdier way of making these claims and demands. And we need to keep in mind that the whole human rights framework was created after World War II, when the world community recognized that what Nazi Germany did in the Holocaust against Jews while it was immoral, it was not illegal because Nazi Germany, distressingly, legalized immoral actions the same way the United States legalized the enslavement or legalized genocide against indigenous people. Governments have a tendency to legitimate the immoral things that they want to do and just get away with saying, well, it's not illegal, so that must make it all right. And so the human rights framework was created in response to the Holocaust because the world community wanted to set limits on what a government could do to its own people. So while Germany's invasion of Poland, for example, was illegal and violated international law, its genocide against Jews who were German were not, as a matter of fact. And so the world community through the UN, United Nations, wanted to put limits, wanted to say that there were positive human rights that governments must do to protect its citizens and to provide them an enabling atmosphere for their human rights to be protected. And then there were negative human rights, things that the government couldn't do to its people, like tell them what to think, tell them what to do, those kinds of things. And so once I realized this coming from the Cairo conference in 1994, I began advocating that we learn more about the 8 categories of human rights protections to which every human being is entitled. And the beauty of the human rights framework is that you have these rights simply because you're human. And let me start by describing the 8 categories. The first category is civil rights. I tend to start teaching about civil rights because that's the framework we're most familiar with in the United States because there was a civil rights movement. Civil rights are your right to be treated as an equal to anyone else in society. They're the non-discrimination rights. And so we all know that discrimination is wrong, and we spend a lot of time in court cases and things like that fighting it. And so that's the set of human rights that we're probably mostly familiar with. The second set are called political human rights. Now, these are the human rights that we can recognize that emanated from the Bill of Rights, because political human rights are things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, or the right to vote. But we are now, of course, recognizing that while we may have the right to vote, the Supreme Court has ruled that we don't have the right to have our votes counted, as they decided in Gore versus Bush in 2000. And with the thousands, apparently, of voter suppression bills that are being propagated across the country, we need to understand that we're in a fight for our political human rights being expressed as the right not only to vote, but the right to choose the candidates we want to represent us instead of the candidates choosing us. So political human rights are very important. The third category is called economic human rights, and that's our right to have an economy managed in such a way that it meets the needs of people on Main Street instead of just the needs of people on Wall Street. And of course, after the 2008 mortgage crisis, Americans legitimately asked the question, why can we bail out Wall Street and not Main Street? Why do we have an educational system, for example, dependent on creating massive debt for students when just a couple of generations ago, in the 1960s, we had sufficient government funding for colleges so that students graduated mostly debt-free? And why did this change under the leadership of Richard Nixon so that now we end up with debt peonage for students trying to get an education? And so fighting for a living wage, for example, is an economic human rights struggle. Uh, Fighting for fairness in the housing market or all kinds of other areas of economic activity are part of the economic human rights movement. There's also social human rights. These are the human rights that are born out of your human needs. Think about the things that you need to live a life of dignity. You need food, you need shelter, you need health care, you need education, you need support if you're not able to take care of yourself. So that brings us into conversation around unemployment, disability, welfare, other things that you need in order to live that life of human dignity. And the beauty of social human rights is that it addresses those vulnerabilities that we all have in some area of our life so that we can actually enjoy the same human rights. The best way I have of explaining it is to say that every child has a human right to an education, but a blind child might need her books in Braille. What that means is that you have to use the concept of intersectionality to determine what that blind child's vulnerabilities are and attend to those vulnerabilities so that she can enjoy the same human rights as a sighted child. That's the way you use intersectional theory, by the way. It's not just a statement of identity, it's a statement of vulnerability. A lot of people misuse it because they think it's just about identity. So that a Scottish bagpipe, player is seen as an identity that's equivalent to being, an African American. It's just an identity, and that's not true unless trying to commit genocide against bagpipe players or something. But anyway, my point is that social human rights are those things to which we are entitled simply because we are human. And let's be clear, I want to make sure that we understand that there is no conflict between your human needs and your human rights. It is your human needs that determine what you need from the human rights framework. As one person has said, Upendra Baxi said, who's an Indian scholar on human rights, he said, those who have the least in life need the most from human rights. And that is so true. Those whose human rights are least likely to be violated can't pontificate about the limits of the framework when they're not the ones who are going to suffer from the violations. The fifth category of human rights protection is cultural human rights. These are the human rights for you to, for example, embrace the culture of your choice, to speak the language of your choice and need. So, for example, anytime you provide services in a language other than English in the United States, you're actually defending people's human right to practice and speak the language of their choice. You probably didn't know that when you printed that poster in Spanish that you were a human rights defender, but that's exactly what you were doing. Freedom of religion is also a human right. No one should be able to tell you what religion, if any, you should practice. But we in the women's movement are very clear in pointing out that freedom from religion is also a human right. We have the human right not to have someone else's religious views imposed upon our bodies, because that's a human rights violation. And unfortunately, people who want to use their religion and weaponize their religion against everybody, even those who don't share their religion, don't see themselves as the human rights violators that they are. And those of us who want to defend ourselves against these impositions are familiar enough with the human rights framework in order to accurately define them as the human rights violators that they are. There is an attempt by the extreme wing of the anti-abortion movement to try to claim human rights for the preborn or the unborn or for embryos or fetuses or whatever they want to call people who are not here yet. Unfortunately for them, it requires a distortion and an intentional misreading of the human rights framework to even make that claim. Because the opening line of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was written in 1948, long before this debate over abortion came about, the opening line of the UDHR says, all human beings are born equal in rights and dignity. In other words, you have to be here to claim the rights. You can't be speculative fiction. You can't be a twinkle in daddy's eye. You have to actually be born. And by the way, the same thing, that same sentiment is echoed in the US Constitution. So you not only have to misread the human rights framework, you have to misread the US Constitution to try to contort them to claim rights for the people who aren't here at the expense of the rights of the people who are here. But let me go on. The sixth category of human rights protection is environmental rights. These are rights that deal with, for example, having clean air, having potable, drinkable water, dealing with climate change, the right not to have genetically modified food foisted upon you without your knowledge, those kinds of things. And so it's very possible that if we don't start paying attention to all the environmental human rights violations that are associated, for example, with climate change, we won't be around very much longer to debate all the other categories of human rights, because there's an urgency to saving the planet that seems to be ignored by many people of power who should know better. The seventh category is called developmental human rights. And these were the human rights that the women of the global South really focused on. And they're called developmental human rights because it is the demand by many countries in the global South to develop their own natural resources. In other words, they point out how so frequently the US government foments and participates in wars over natural resources because we can never effectively explain how our oil keeps getting under their sand. And of course, we're dealing with, the war in the Ukraine being disguised as a war of aggression, which of course it is, but the reason for the aggression is the natural resources that in Ukraine that that Russia covets. And we need to have a clear geopolitical explanation for why our government is so quick to use our military to go around and expropriate other people's natural resources while we offer the excuse that we want to protect Afghan women or we want to get rid of a dictator or whatever. We offer a lot of mealy-mouthed excuses for the fact that we're in resource wars. And we really do not want the global South to develop the same way that the global North has, because not only would they be competitors for the same resources, but most of the resources we covet are in the global South. And so we don't want them to be able to use developmental human rights claims to protect their own natural resources. So it's complicated to understand the geopolitical situation nowadays, but it's so necessary because a lot of wrong is being done in our name as Americans, and we should be responsible for that. We should be knowledgeable about that. The eighth category of human rights is my favorite. It's called sexual human rights. Starting in the 1970s, particularly with the first World Conference for Women that was held in Mexico City in 75, followed by the declaration of the World Decade for Women by the United Nations, I'm sure. Okay, thank you. All of those things that are associated with reproductive rights are, in effect, sexual rights. And so this is something that the global women's movement started promoting. It was a hard sell at the United Nations level. It wasn't until 20 years later that sexual rights started to be talked about at the UN level. And in 1999, there was a sexual Congress, a World Congress on sexual rights that started offering us language on it. But an interesting thing has happened to the whole framework of sexual rights, and that is when you start talking about the right to marry, the right to have children, the right to sexual pleasure, we were surprised as feminists when the LGBTQ movement started reframing itself as a sexual rights movement because those things sound pretty attractive. The right to determine if and when you'll have sex and if and when you'll marry, and the right to kids and those kinds of things. I do have a problem with the queer rights movement, though, claiming the sexual rights framework. And my problem is this. I don't want the LGBTQ movement to make the same mistake that the African American freedom movement made, and that is claim only one set of the human rights. Because right now, the African freedom movement is known as a civil rights movement when it should have been known as a human rights movement. And I don't wish that same thing to happen with the queer rights movement, to only claim one category of human rights when one is entitled to all the categories of human rights. I mean, freedom to marry doesn't address what if both parties getting married are still broke and don't have health insurance kind of thing. And so if you're going to reframe yourself or refashion yourself as a human rights movement, make sure that you include all the human rights and don't accept the pitting of one set of rights against the other, like freedom of speech against the right not to be hungry, those kinds of things. And before I close talking about human rights, I want to make sure that you understand that these are not a closed, finite set of rights, that new movements are developing every day that are demanding new human rights considerations. I think that the ninth category of human rights protections to which we have are entitled and for which we all have to fight are going to be digital human rights, because it's fairly clear that if you are not digitally connected to the internet, then that's going to compromise your ability to get an education, your ability to do banking or obtain health care. It is clear that people on the other side of the digital divide will not have the same enjoyment of human rights that people who are digitally privileged will have. And so it's really important for us to understand that it is social movements that have demanded and claimed these human rights, and it's going to be social movements that continue to demand new human rights. I actually do think that the 10th category of human rights might be the right to participate in space exploration, because it's only the billionaires that think that they should have the right to go into space while they leave a ruined planet behind. But having said all of that, you can see why I'm so attracted to the fullness of the human rights framework and feel that it's the best foundation on which to rest our demand for reproductive justice. And so in closing, let me talk about the panoply of what we mean by reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice, because people hear those three terms and they may think that they're in conflict when in fact they are constituents, they are components of the same movement. The reproductive health framework is focused on providing health care to individuals. This is where the doctors and the nurses and the hospitals and the doulas and the midwives and the patient advocates and pharmaceutical companies and all of that, they're the ones providing and involved in making sure that healthcare is available to one extent or another to individuals within our society. The reproductive rights movement, on the other hand, is the advocacy arm of the reproductive health movement. They're the ones, for example, who fight to make sure that not only abortion and birth control are kept safe, legal, and accessible, but they fight to make sure, for example, that the drugs and devices approved by the FDA are safe for people to use, particularly let's talking about birth control devices like IUDs or hormonal contraceptives or things like that. They're the ones that have to, by definition, fight within the confines of the US Constitution and the US jurisprudence system because they have to use the windows of opportunity and the tools available to them. And that's why they are quite naturally preoccupied with what's happening at the Supreme Court level and the threat to Roe v. Wade. And of course, like SB 8 and the other bills that are threatening women's human rights across the country. This is where they put their focus. And the other synonym for the reproductive rights movement is the pro-choice movement. And that's a great term, by the way. We in the reproductive justice movement don't try to tell people they can't use the term pro-choice when you're fighting for abortion rights. Pro-choice is a wonderful term to use. It's a wonderful framework to use, even though it recognizes that not everyone has choices in the marketplace of ideas. But still, reproductive rights is an invaluable component of the reproductive justice framework or model. And then there's reproductive justice. We tend to see that as the human rights-based organizing model, where we bring together to defend both reproductive health and rights, people who represent all the social justice issues, whether it's housing rights, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's education justice, whether it's criminal justice, environmental justice. We bring all the justices together, for example, within our organizing model under reproductive justice. And so there is no contradiction or tension between reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice. As a matter of fact, as we describe our movement, we'll say reproductive health, rights, and justice to show that we are talking about a movement that works in tandem and in collaboration with the different wings of the same movement. And I guess I really want to close with talking about the threat to Roe v. Wade right now, because of course, a lot of attention is understandably focused on that. Of course, we're not surprised in the reproductive justice movement that we've got yet again a bunch of men trying to tell women what to do with their bodies. I mean, this has been going on forever, not just in the United States. I mean, Emperor Augustus tried to ban forms of birth control back in ancient Rome because he thought that elite Roman women weren't having enough babies and stuff, and he ordered them to have more babies. I don't think it was because Roman women were having less sex that the Roman birth rate was going down. It was because they had learned techniques of contraception and abortifacients from ancient Egypt, and they were using those techniques, and Emperor Augustus didn't like it, and he tried to order them to stop. Well, it didn't work then, and trust me, it ain't gonna work now. As long as women are able to get pregnant, they are going to constantly seek to manage their own fertility, and it's not going to heavily be determined by what the church says, what the state says, even what the individual men in their lives say, because they understand that it's about them taking care of business in terms of managing their own fertility, because they will be the ones most likely to risk their health and their life giving birth and certainly committing at least 2 decades of their life to active parenting if they make a decision to give birth. And so, with all the increasing restrictions on abortion, we have to have a multiple focus. We have to focus on what's happening at the judicial level with the Supreme Court. We have to focus on what's happening at the legislative level, at the state level and the federal level in terms of trying to pass progressive pro-woman legislation as well as resist hostile anti-woman legislation. But most importantly, in my opinion, we have to keep our main concern on the women who are most likely to suffer under this kind of assault on our women's human rights. And so I'm really pleased to see the emergence even more strongly of women who are making sure that women have access, for example, to the abortion pill, or there's an almost like an underground railroad of women going to other states that are friendlier to access services. Now, of course, women should not have to go through all these challenges and jump through all these hoops to basically affirm and protect their own human rights. But these are the conditions that we're having to deal with. And what I've seen through my research into how women have historically dealt with, they will use whatever knowledge, whatever technology, whatever they can to manage their own fertility, even if it's not safe. And so I'm really pleased to see this grassroots movement come up that is keeping the vulnerable women in the center of the lens, to making sure that they have abortion access, even if it is flying beneath the radar. We are trying to do our best to make sure that women have what they need, even as we face an increasingly hostile environment that's trying to really coerce white women into having more babies while punishing women of color for our fertility. I am convinced that all of these restrictions on birth control and abortion and evidence-based sex education are all strategies to coerce white women to have more babies. I'm not convinced that they want more brown or black babies. And I think I would be hard pressed to not laugh at anybody that asserted that all of these restrictions on birth control and abortion were designed to increase the populations of color in the United States. And so why don't I close there and save some time for Q&A. And thank y'all for listening to me.
Thank you so much for that information. As you saw, and I don't know if you saw it in some of the comments, people really, really appreciate, your thoughts and your knowledge. What I want to do is I want to introduce our panelists. We have 3 panelists with us here today. We have Sara Matthiesen. She's an assistant professor of history and women's gender and sexuality studies at George Washington University. Her book, Reproduction Reconceived, Family Making and the Limits of Choice After Roe versus Wade, shows how the effects of incarceration, for-profit healthcare, disease, and poverty have been worsened by the state neglect in the decades following Roe versus Wade, forcing most to work harder to maintain family. Next, we have Clarissa Dawson-Hoffman. She graduated from Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky in 2014 with a Master's of Social Work degree. Clarissa is elated to be working toward a PhD in counseling psychology at Texas Women's University. Currently, she works closely with experienced trauma-related issues, depression, anxiety, relationship issues, addiction, identity issues, and more. As a queer Black woman, she believes representation is imperative for her fellow Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as Black people of queer experience, to have options in the mental health world. We last have Austin Rupert. With over 14 years of higher education experience, he's currently serving as the Assistant Director of the Student Wellness Center at the University of Texas at Dallas, and is also the president of the Black Faculty and Staff Alliance. His passion for helping the Black community has driven his current career focus as he works to develop and implement comprehensive and inclusive evidence-based health education initiatives aimed at promoting healthier behaviors and overall wellness among college-age individuals. Welcome, you guys. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Desiree. Should I start with a couple of comments?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for that really generous introduction, and thanks to everyone who made this event possible. It's really a privilege to be a panelist with such renowned speakers and impressive people. So I also want to save time for the Q&A because I'm eager to hear from everyone who has attended, and I'm going to keep my comments brief. And given that we had the amazing opportunity to hear so much from Dr. Ross about the RJ framework and its origins, I thought I would just say a couple of things about what I think an RJ framework makes visible about the period, the historical period following Roe v. Wade, which decriminalized abortion in the US in 1973, and have a chance to say how this has been really helpful for my own work. So I think when we discuss reproductive rights in the US, sort of in mainstream conversation, we tend to frame them, and especially we tend to frame abortion post-Roe in the language of attack or sort of concerted targeted attack. And so there's obviously good reason for this. In addition to what Dr. Ross mentioned about the threat to Roe, 2021 set the record for the number of restrictions passed at the state level on abortion access. And we can also think about the sort of blaming and shaming of Black women's fertility for all kinds of social problems that has justified the historical practice of coercive sterilization of not only Black women, but also Latina and Native women. And we have had, just as recent as last year, reports of that practice ongoing in ICE facilities in Georgia that were performed on immigrant women. So there is a reason, and we don't need to look far to see why attack is such a powerful sort of framework for thinking about the constraints that are placed on reproductive rights and this sort of daily threats to reproductive autonomy. But at least for me, in the demand that the reproductive justice principles offer, particularly the right to parent and the right to raise children in safe and healthy communities, I see a recognition that in a just world, public institutions would be obligated to fulfill their role, which I see as providing families with the basic necessities required to live, so that not so much energy is being spent on simply surviving, but could be spent on actually thriving. And this is sort of falls in the realm of the economic and social human rights that Dr. Ross was talking about. So of course, this would mean having to cease the kind of state violence that threatens poor families and families of color, things like police brutality, or our punitive immigration laws that detain and deport immigrants. But it would also mean sort of serving a more positive role or active role in providing families with public goods. So in their early 1970s campaign to enshrine a constitutional right to basic income, the National Welfare Rights Organization actually they framed this demand as a right to life in their rejection of the idea that anyone should have to work just to live, and in a demand to have the state recognize that women on welfare who took care of their children were actually performing an incredibly valuable job. And so to me, that right to life might offer, we might want to replace the dominant phrase right to life with this other historical meaning as we think about economic and social human rights. So these are the kinds of demands that I see an RJ framework making on public institutions that are currently failing to meet their obligation to everyday people. When we look at the history, the historical period following Roe through this framework, we see that reproductive rights have also been constrained through widespread neglect of poor families, of families of color, of immigrant families by public institutions that should be in the business of providing public goods. So just to give, a smattering of very brief examples, even before Roe, so like, what does that mean to neglect families materially? Even before Roe was decided, President Nixon vetoed a bill that would have delivered universal childcare. So obviously leaving us with a situation working families currently are facing of how you perform two jobs with only the recognition that you are doing one for wage labor, but not the one that doesn't get a wage, but still make sure your child or children can survive. When the National Welfare Rights Organization and other groups campaigned for a guaranteed basic income throughout the 1970s, they were ultimately defeated by economic arguments, citing inflationary pressures that really killed such efforts. So that was sort of another blow, or what I would say we could think of as state neglect to families' demands to just have basic needs met. We have seen throughout this period, particularly activists who were involved in addressing or challenging rising rates of Black infant mortality, demands for more robust public health care in the late 1970s and 1980s, but we remain in a society that ties healthcare to one's employment status and makes that a privatized realm for profit making rather than distributing health and wellness to everyday people. Queer families and trans families, queer and trans parents with children struggle for legal recognition, and just the fact that to be legally recognized as families and to have the protections that come with such legal recognition. And prisons and detention centers, having separated poor families that are overwhelmingly of color, dole out daily neglect on the inside that threatens people's lives. So this is just, these are some of the forms of neglect that unfolded during the post-Roe period that I think can help us try to to hold alongside the fact that ongoing attacks were happening post-Roe, but also this violence in the form of neglect was unfolding alongside them simultaneously. And I think if we can hold both of those things, we are able to recognize it becomes more possible to see just how hard families and their advocates had to work simply to survive. So obviously no activists choose the conditions in which they fight for justice, and those who were organizing around families' ability to care for and raise their children with dignity had to fight against those concerted attacks and neglect in the face of the very powerful messaging that Dr. Ross mentioned, that told poor families, and especially poor Black families, that if you are struggling, you really only have yourself to blame. This was a dominant ideology of the conservative right that really took precedent in the 1980s, and that neoliberals continued into the 1990s. So this meant, what did that mean for activists and the families that they were working alongside? It meant that a lot of that activist effort was put in trying to step in where local and federal government refused to provide families with the much needed resources and support that they needed, while also trying to hold public institutions accountable and sort of elicit more resources from those institutions that should be providing them in the first place. And so at least in my book that Desiree very generously mentioned, I talk a lot about how mutual aid was an integral part to all of the organizing efforts that I talk about in that history. And that is an essential component of any successful social movement. But when you are in a landscape that is so overwhelmingly defined by neglect, by the refusal of public institutions to acknowledge the immense labor and resource intensive project of having and raising a family, what happens is that the need overwhelms what an organization or movement can provide. And so a story that is repeated over and over again in the book is how mutual aid and sort of direct service came to be the priority and sort of limited what could happen in terms of pressuring institutions to have a more thoroughgoing reform or change at the institutional level. And so I just offer kind of those couple of lessons to all of you for the Q&A, because even as they present us with a sort of challenging activist or organizing question, what I also show time and time again in the book is that these efforts were so integral to ensuring that families turned the blame that was so often pointed at them by politicians and government officials outward at the broader systems of capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy that devalue the family making of poor people and people of color, so that they could realize that those conditions were not of their own making and try to hold institutions accountable and get what we all deserve from the institutions that are supposed to be serving us. So I really thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking more in the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that. Carissa, did you want to give some feedback? Or I know we wanted to ask you about your expertise as a licensed clinical social worker. What advice you would give to a student that's experiencing reproductive injustice?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you for allowing me to share space. It's really a privilege. I actually used one of Dr. Ross's videos in a teaching format, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's like right there. But so I guess my part of this is more experiential. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I work with trauma on a regular basis, and reproductive injustice comes up a lot in my work with women. I specifically work with Black women, Black queer women. And so the amount of intersections that I help folks manage and navigate on a daily basis are vast. So for me specifically, what I would say to a student experiencing reproductive injustice, as a student myself, I am in my first year of my PhD program, and I can tell you right now, I am 31 weeks pregnant, and the amount of things I've already had to navigate have been extreme, as a Black woman and as a pregnant Black woman. And so I would really just encourage to advocate for yourself. Know what policies are in place for you, and look them up. We always talk about the fine print, read it. It's really important. I'm grateful that I go to TWU, where they already have implemented a lot of policies for pregnant students. There's lactation rooms around. There's you can submit a form that is an agreement between you and your professors on, hey, what happens if you give birth during my class? And what does that look like? So you're not losing out on money and time, which is really great. And not, I don't think a majority of institutions have that. And so definitely advocating for what policies are there. You know, injustice gaslights us to think that we don't know what's best for us, even though we do. We're the only ones that know. And so another thing is seeking fellowship with those who are experiencing something similar, right? Those 12 Black women came together because they knew, right, that this wasn't right. There was things that needed to be changed. There are power in numbers. And so when we can find each other and fellowship with each other and grow with each other and learn and change with each other, that's how things are actually changed, brought up, noticed. And so those, I think, are kind of like my main 3 points, as far as like what I would tell, you know, a student who is experiencing reproductive injustice. And I would also just like to comment about Dr. Ross's LGBTQ population not focusing on one aspect of human rights. That was an interesting statement. And I think too, I would challenge to say that the sexual rights are what is noticed, what people focus in on, but there's so much work being done in the other parts of the human rights framework for the LGBTQ population that it just gets mulled over by, you know, the sexual part, because that's kind of what unfortunately people find to be grotesque or weird or odd. And so that really struck me, and it really made me think like, yeah, you're right. But then also too, we are working, it's just not as much in maybe social media or in, you know, platforms that it needs to be.
Thank you, Carissa. We really appreciate it. Austin, we have the question. So can you tell us what kind of resources that UT students have access to?
Yes, absolutely. First, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be here, and sharing this platform with such phenomenal voices. I personally have already learned so much, and so I'm enjoying this. But hopefully there are quite a bit of, you know, UT Dallas students still on this call, and if not, if you have connections with UT Dallas students, please share this information with them. Here at UTD, we have quite a few resources that are on campus available to our students that are free of charge. As an educator, I obviously feel like it's important that I make students aware of these resources. So on a day-to-day basis, my number one priority is plugging students into a lot of these resources, especially our marginalized populations who are often denied resources within their own communities, who often feel like, you know, if I go somewhere, they're not here to help me, that kind of stuff. So I want to make sure that our students know that we do have resources available to them on campus. I personally am part of the Student Wellness Center. For us, we feel like health starts with education. So we're focused on educating students in a way that can empower them to take control of their own lives and make informed decisions for themselves. You know, we cover things like different health and wellness topics such as alcohol and drug education, nutrition, sexual responsibility, bystander intervention, all those kinds of things. Offering one-on-one consultations, as well as group presentations and campus-wide events. We educate on safer sex practices. We offer free contraception in our office. We offer STI education, education on consent, education on pleasure, all those things. We also offer, you know, free menstrual products in our office. And then I try to provide some sort of, you know, free HIV testing 3 times a semester. just right here within our office. So students don't have to feel like they need to go off campus for a lot of these resources. I don't want them to have to pay for these resources. These are resources that everyone should have access to. In addition to our office, the Student Wellness Center, there's a Student Health Center. So, they provide for both primary and preventative health care. They offer pelvic exams, pregnancy counseling, birth control, things like vaccines such as Gardasil. They offer not just HIV testing, but testing for a wide range of STIs. That is not free. However, the university does pick up the majority of the cost. And if a student maybe needs some of those services and they can't afford it, they can come and see the Student Wellness Center, and we have some off-campus resources that are free of charge that we can connect them with. The Student Health Center also offers a sexual assault nurse examiner. So students, faculty, or staff who have experienced a sexual assault may choose to access this service at no charge. It's a partnership that they have with the Turning Point, which is a local resource for survivors of sexual violence, if you're not familiar. Another great resource, like when I talk about that, that educational piece, a phenomenal place to receive education on our campus is our Gallerstein Gender Center. They focus on advocacy and support of women and LGBT plus people, as well as any other communities facing oppression. They offer things like education workshops, lectures, resource referrals, and a lot of those much needed celebratory programs for a lot of our students who maybe are not celebrated at home or in their community. Some of their educational programs that they offer throughout the semester are things like the Safe Zone Ally trainings, their Cultural of Equity training, as well as the Gender Studies lecture series. So they have a really great friendly staff. Please go into the Gender Center and meet with them, borrow some of their resources. Please get connected with their community. And then lastly, we do offer a counseling center and a center for students of recovery on our campus. So additionally, these departments offer support for support and counseling pertaining to sexuality, sexual orientation, sexual assault, interpersonal violence, trauma, experiences of marginalization and oppression. So I know that's a lot, but we have a lot of resources on our campus, and this isn't all of them. So please, if you are a UTD student or you are connected with UTD students, please let them know about some of these resources so they can get any support or guidance or education that they may be able to benefit from.
Thank you so much, Austin. So I do have two quick questions from the audience, and then we'll go into live questions. So, and this is for the panelists or Dr. Ross, whomever has the answer. With the journey in creating a safe environment to give birth, do you all know of any resources on giving birth framework to share with those who are researching birth plans and things to consider beforehand?
I'm going to defer to my panelists. I mean, I last gave birth in 1969, so I think my data may be a little dated.
I could jump into this one. So I honestly, y'all, Google is like the bomb. So when I got pregnant, so this is my second child. My first child is 6. I had a horrible birthing experience with my first child. I gave birth in a hospital. It was a predominantly white town that I gave birth in. And so with this pregnancy, I was very, very diligent in that I wanted some mostly Black folks on my birthing team. And so I literally Googled Black midwives, and I wanted a midwife. I did not want an OB. I specifically Googled Black midwives in my area. I specifically Googled Black doulas in my area. And so I do have a white midwife who is very, she's an ally. And the only reason I picked her is because the Black one didn't take my insurance. And so my doula is a Black woman. And the experience that I've had already so far has been astronomically different than my first birthing experience. And so I know, like in my area, I'm in Denton, there are, I want to say there are probably not as many Black birthing team members as there should be for the amount of folks that live here. But the DFW area has a lot, more than you would think. Black midwives, Black OBs, Black doulas, Black pelvic floor therapists, things like that, even past like your main people. And really just trying to seek those folks out via Google, Facebook groups. I don't know if we still do Facebook. I don't know. I do. But Facebook groups of people have specific Facebook groups for folks looking for Black providers in general. And so seeking out those kind of resources is huge. They're there. You just have to seek them out. And as you connect with one, you start connecting with others, and they'll say, oh, are you looking for a Black doula? I have somebody in mind. Are you looking for a Black so-and-so? Are you looking for a queer so-and-so? Are you looking, whatever you're looking for, the main resource that you find first is most likely going to lead you in the direction of others. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Kristen. Our next question is going to be, what paid family leave benefits do you guys think that our government should, what other countries' benefits do you think our government should look to for guidance?
I can start maybe. I think, a lot of people, when they talk about paid family leave, invoke Scandinavia as kind of the model to look to for significant paid family leave. That would be great if the US, that would be a great, bar to meet for the US, given that we still don't have federal paid family leave. We have, 12 weeks of unpaid family leave at the federal level. But obviously the discussion, the debate over Build Back Better was very much about paid family leave, but also more generally resources that we would provide to people to be able to take care of their children. So universal pre-K or subsidies for childcare, the child tax credit. I think that those are all really important things that we should be demanding. And there's also kind of this, I don't know, when I talked about the National Welfare Rights Organization, for example, I think when we talk about a guaranteed basic income, I'm not sure how familiar people are with that concept anymore, but when the NWRO and other groups were organizing for it, it was a very uncontroversial demand. So I also, when we talk about paid family leave, kind of think it's helpful to imagine even beyond paid family leave of like what the government could provide so that we could spend the time we want with our loved ones in the way that we want, and not have work always be kind of the first and foremost priority. But that's probably very far down the road, given how controversial even Build Back Better proved to be, and how sort of laughable the idea of quote unquote care infrastructure was amongst many congressional representatives. So not to end on a negative note, but those are some thoughts.
Thank you. I think we have a live question, Aurora.
Yeah, hi, my name is Aurora. So I have been going through the journey of IVF since fall of last fall, basically. And I just wanted to know, Dr. Ross and the other panelists, if you can talk a little bit about the paradox of trying to take away, women's right to choose, while at the same time not providing the resources and benefits like fertility benefits to women who may start later in life and are having trouble conceiving. I just find it's and the reason why I talk about this is it can be a very lonely journey. And I think it's something that we need to highlight much, much more, because it's very difficult for both men and women, but particularly for women. And I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about that paradox, because my experience is that the cost of IVF, because my company does not cover it, have fertility benefits, is basically my 1 year salary, which is astronomical. It's upwards of $30,000 to $35,000 a year upwards. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that paradox. And that's my question.
I have recently been spending more time thinking about the concept I call reproductive futurism, because it is necessary for us to look at this overpromise by ART, or assisted reproductive technologies, and how they more likely will be overlaid on our pre-existing social inequalities, that they will not provide the utopian reproductive futures that we all wish they could, but in fact will be distorted so that the people with the most privilege will get the most benefit from assisted reproductive technologies, and the people with the most vulnerabilities will be the ones most neglected by them. And so we need to take a very analytical look at ART technology as a whole. As a matter of fact, there's a tendency for it to overpromise, like with promising that you can store your eggs and get a baby later, when only 13% of those pregnancies even result in a baby. They don't tell people that they got an 87% failure rate, even as they charge people $20,000 to store their eggs, because of course they don't want to turn off that financial tap. But your question, to be more specific, Aurora, makes me think of how the people in power really don't respect what women want and need, because if they paid any attention to that, they could actually achieve their own goals. If they wanted women, particularly white women, to have more babies, all they'd have to do is support the feminist agenda, and it probably would happen, because the feminist agenda demands increased support for childcare, increased inclusion in healthcare, job security, so that one can have time to effectively parent and not get pushed out of the job market, educational opportunities. All the things that we demand would actually encourage women to have more babies, but they'd rather use a handmaid's tale approach than an incentive approach. because an incentive approach would resemble too much like the feminist agenda. And they'd never want to admit that the feminist movement was right about anything and stuff. But I am convinced that if they wanted more babies, they would do things like support fertility treatments for people who desire more children. They would support daycare, childcare, loan forgiveness, assistance and down payments on household, getting a house and those kinds of things. And I'm sure women, being the logical creatures that we are, would make reproductive decisions in the light of what we could actually do for the benefit of those children that we would have, and kind of thing. Strangely enough, and I'm probably going to get in trouble by saying this, these bozos today aren't even as smart as Hitler, because those things I talked about were part of the Nazi plan. They actually did offer incentives to white German women to have more babies, and it worked.
Wow.
And so I'm not, they never want to see us as human beings. So they never want to treat us as capable decision makers. They'd rather treat us as chattel and use a handmaid's tale approach to trying to compel our fertility instead of helping us be self-determining over it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ross. I want to thank all of the panelists for your answers. I will now turn it over to Dr. Greer.
Thank you, Desiree, and thank you so much to Dr. Loretta Ross and to our three panelists. It has been such an honor to share space and learn from you all today. And for myself and for many of us, I'll say, we've been learning from you in particular, Dr. Ross, for years. And so it's really very special to share this today. And thank you also to Desiree for facilitating our conversation, and to the audience for being here and for posing questions. I wish that we had more time together, but alas, we'll just have to think about our own futures. I wanted to also take a moment to thank the very generous sponsors from various corners of UT Dallas who made this event possible. So the BLM Planning Committee really took the lead in this event. And it was also co-sponsored and organized by the School of Arts and Humanities Teach-In Collective. The Gender Center here at UTD provided support, as did the Pre-Law Advising Center, the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology, and the Program in Public and Nonprofit Management in our school called EPS. So we are very grateful and heartened to have such support at this institution. Finally, as we draw to a close, I'll just invite people to provide feedback on this event. The links have been shared. You can either scan that barcode or follow a link in the chat that I believe Aurora has offered. And one last note, this, as I said, one of the co-organizers was the Teach-In series. If you're interested in other Teach-In events, you can join our email list through another link that is shared in the chat. So once again, thank you so much to our panelists and to Dr. Ross, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all your work.
Thank you.